In this video we're going to look at this whole topic of international competitiveness and the measures that are used in the international economy to consider the competitiveness of a country. And then at the end of this we're going to look at some data on the UK and see what the Global Competitiveness Index actually looks at, which is more than just simple data like on wages and productivity and that sort of thing. So it widens it out a little bit. So the first thing that we need to say is that the measures of competitiveness, three different things: one, relative unit labour costs; two, relative export prices; and then we come back to the terms of trade index as well. Okay, so let's look at the first one here, the relative unit labour costs. Now, you already studied in microeconomics the idea that the unit cost, or the average cost in microeconomics, is worked out, really calculated by looking at the productivity and then compare it to the wages of the workers. So if productivity was rising, the unit cost of producing one good would be going down. Hidden assumption there is that the wage that is paid to every worker that you employ is a constant level, it's the same wage. So there's an inverse relationship between productivity and average cost. And it's the same for the macroeconomy, where what economists do is they try to find a percentage change in the average earnings. So they look at the earnings ratios here, average earnings, change in average earnings, and divide it by the change in productivity. So what they say, let's give you an example: if average earnings are rising at 5%, but our workers are 5% more productive, they're producing 5% more goods, it's costing us 5% more, so the cost for one good stays the same. However, if we were paying 5% more to our workers and they're only 2% more productive, then obviously the cost of making one good will go up. And so there's this inverse relationship here between productivity and unit costs again. So as on a macro basis, then obviously what happens is we look at the index numbers, if you like, for change in average earnings, change in productivity. Now, in order then to take that a bit further, you've got to compare that, the unit labour cost in, say, the UK, with the unit labour cost in another country. And so you come to this ratio, which is the relative unit labour costs, which are simply the unit labour costs in the UK divided by the unit labour costs in an overseas country. And they'll be done on an index number basis, of course. So that means that if the unit cost is rising in the UK, the relative unit labour cost is rising compared to, say, an overseas country, and that makes us less competitive. So we are more competitive as a country if, when you look at this is the unit labour cost and it's made up of the earnings and productivity. We are more competitive if our average earnings in the UK are growing slower than they are overseas, or up here, we're more competitive if in the UK productivity is rising faster than overseas. So it's this great relationship between earnings and productivity, and then comparing that between the UK and other countries to give us our relative unit labour costs. There are sometimes measures where they will include the exchange rate in this. So we can look at the exchange rate here, and the second measure of competitiveness is when we are looking at relative export prices. So our export prices compared to the prices in the foreign market. And so the argument would be, country would be less competitive if our export prices are rising faster than the competitors' export prices. So in other words, if we're both, say, the UK and the US companies are selling into Europe, if the UK companies are finding their export prices are rising faster than the American companies, then we will lose competitiveness against the American companies. And it can be down to two things, really. Number one, inflation in the UK being faster, let's say, than America, or the exchange rate rising. And as I say, sometimes that exchange rate gets used and added to the relative unit labour costs as well. But I keep them separate. There's a nice little sort of idea here of analysis and evaluation, which would say that if our export prices are rising because inflation in the UK is faster, greater than, let's say, America, then, according to your purchasing power parity theory, the exchange rate is going to fall, which therefore brings us our competitiveness back again because we've got a lower exchange rate. So that's a nice thing to put in as evaluation if you were considering relative export prices. And the last one is the great Terms of Trade Index, which I hope you remember from earlier in the course. And the Terms of Trade Index, if you remember, are the price of our exports divided by the price of our imports, and it's an index number then of export prices divided by index number of import prices. But the argument was when we did the Terms of Trade is that if that's increasing, the Terms of Trade Index, then there's an increase in our living standards, because if the price of our exports are going up and the price of imports are staying the same, let's say, then for every export we sell, we've got more money and we can buy more imports, or we could sell less exports to get the same number of imports. So whichever way you look at it, our standard of living, number of goods and services we've got in the economy, would actually increase. But in terms of competitiveness, remember, the UK becomes less competitive because the price of our exports are rising is going to cause there to be a fall in the demand for our exports. So the idea about the living standards is always on the basis that there's no change in the quantity, whereas when you're doing the terms of trade, you need to think about the change in the quantity. It could also be that lower import prices, that could cause that ratio there to rise. That might reduce your cost push inflation, which then brings us back to lower inflation and therefore becoming more competitive over here. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of what you actually measure. And I thought it'd be nice to show you two other things here just for some application. And the first is this. I'll move myself over here. This is a graphic taken from the Competitiveness Report, Global Competitiveness Index. And if you search for that and put in 2019, you would get these sorts of things coming up. In 2020 and 21, they've changed the way that they do this report now, so it's not really as useful for economists, to be honest. But this is the UK, and this gives us our overall score. In that case, in 2019, we were 9th overall in the world in the UK. But why I put this up is I wanted really to show you that there is an overall score, but also they question then about how enabling is the environment. So let's move me out here. How enabling is the environment for firms, etc. So what about institutions and infrastructure, ICT, the adoption of ICT? Now, you can see that we're pretty poor at that in the UK. We were down in 31st in the world. Macro stability, we were up at 1st. Now, I think given what's happened since then, I think that number has certainly come down. Our position in the world has decreased even from 9th in recent years, to be honest. But also, not only then do they look at the environment, in that sense, they look at human capital, they look at health and skills, they look at markets, and this is an interesting one. So they consider the product and the labour and the financial and the size of markets. So this can be really linked to your microeconomics and how competitive industries are, what's concentration ratios, etc. And then lastly, they look at what they call the innovation ecosystem, where how dynamic is a business, and here how innovative capability there is. So this gives you a good view of really what would be happening in the real world to our competitiveness, which takes you a bit deeper than those three different measures. And lastly, I thought I would show you something that's come up from the Resolution Foundation here. It's a nice June 2022. Let's move over here. And this was a report that they did on Brexit and how that affected UK's competitiveness. But what is important, I think, just to read here is that it says that Brexit has not had the expected effect of narrowly reducing our exports. Instead, it's broadly reduced how open and competitive the economy is. So it's reduced how open our competitiveness is, which will therefore reduce productivity and wages in the decade ahead. And they go here down to here. If you look here, it says that the UK has avoided a large relative fall in UK exports, but this is in part because the impact of Brexit appears to be more general reduction in openness and competitiveness. So the argument is that Brexit has actually reduced our competitiveness over time, and you can read this further if you want. And labour productivity, they say, will be reduced by 1.3%, etc. That leads to lower wage growth and those sorts of things. So hopefully that gives you a good sort of context for this. You need to look up some of these things. This is Resolution Foundation, as I say. But the measures of competitiveness that you do need to know: relative unit labour costs, relative export prices, and terms of trade index.